Sergei Ozhegov with us tonight. Dr. Ozhegov.
It is a great pleasure to me to be here and to give you a lecture on the architecture of my country. Of course, it is very difficult to tell everything on architecture of Soviet Union in 1 hour and even in 2 hours. You see, first of all, I need to tell you that it is rather often that it is taught that Soviet architecture is Russian architecture or Russian architecture is Soviet architecture. I need to explain, first of all, that our country, Soviet Union, is a federation of 15 republics with different peoples. Each of them has its own culture, its own art, and its own architecture. The greatest of the republics is Russian Republic. It is the biggest after its population, and it owns probably the greatest culture among all the other republics. You see, that's why, first of all, I want to represent you only one part of the multi-nation Soviet Union, only the architecture of one of the republics, of Russian Republic, this historical architecture, to give you at least a short, a brief idea of this architecture, and after that I will try to give you also a very brief idea on the development of architecture in Soviet Union in whole, because it is now more or less united in all the country. Of course, again, each republic has its own peculiarities of architecture and development of architecture, but anyway, it is more united than it was before. Let me start from the Russian architecture. You see, Russia is the country of cities. A lot of cities and towns were built in Russia beginning from the time of the creation of the first Russian state in the 10th century AD. This first Russian state was Kiev, Russia, the enormous feudal state with many different cities, and among them the city of Novgorod, which you see now on this slide, was of the greatest importance. It was the city in the north part of Russia, the city which was typical for this early period of development of Russia, what it was typical for that time. The Russian cities were fortified cities because, you see, from the very beginning of its existence, Russia had to defend itself from different invasions of different enemies from east and west as well. From east there were Tatars, from west mostly the German invasions. And Novgorod was a typical fortified town with so-called Kremlin, that means the fortress, and inside this Kremlin, under the defense of its walls, the town itself was in existence. You can see here these city walls. How looked these early Russian cities? They were built mostly of wood, wooden houses. Only a little number of buildings were built of bricks or of stone. They were mostly churches, the most monumental buildings. That's why nearly all the history of Russian architecture before the 18th century will be represented here as the architecture of Russian churches, because nearly no wooden buildings are in existence, and the eldest wooden buildings belong only to the very end of 17th and the very beginning of 18th century. Russian architecture Russian religious architecture was originated from Byzantium, but of course not completely. Mostly the Christian ideology was brought from Byzantium to Russia. As to the types of the buildings, which is one of the eldest buildings of this time, is represented by the Saint Sophia Cathedral in Novgorod, which belongs to the end of 10th century. You can see that its appearance is quite different from the cathedral under the same name, which was built in Byzantium, the Saint Sophia Cathedral. It reflects a little bit the wooden architecture, which was built of different cells, and these cells are reflected in the plan with many pillars in the center, and also in the elevations, which has a number of projections on its walls. But it is one of the sources of the development of Russian architecture, the architecture of ancient Novgorod. It was the source, one of the sources for the development of architecture in Moscow, which became in the 13th century, in the 13th, 14th, mostly in 14th century, the capital of Russia and the center of the development of Russian culture. The second important source of the development of Russian architecture was architecture of the city of Vladimir and Suzdal. I will show you only one monument of this period. It is the well-known church of Our Lady near Vladimir in the field, standing now alone, but formerly it was the church built near the palace of the Prince of Vladimir. Now it is standing, you see, alone, and it represents one of the best masterpieces of Russian architecture of medieval period. It was constructed in the beginning of the 12th century. I will show you the number of slides which represent this church of Our Lady at the river Nerl near Vladimir, and which gives you an idea of the appearance of the typical small Russian churches and its decoration, elements of which were used later in the architecture of Moscow. You see which elements? This so-called perspective framing of the entrance, which gives here this entrance, this framing of the entrance to this church gives an excellent idea of this perspective entrance. Also, you see so-called arch belts at the level of the second floor, and really such second floor was in existence inside churches. And the decoration, the sculptural decoration, which is here not very rich, but anyway, it gives an interesting idea of the decoration in the technique of stone carving in this architecture. Here are some details of this Vladimir and Suzdal architecture. Again, this entrance door, this arch belt, and on the top, this arch belt, which is very typical for medieval architecture, representing the skill of different masters who carved of stone the elements of different columns, which all are different, the capitals and cantilevers here. And at last, the sculptural decoration of the top of this building. You can see here this scene from Bible when David is playing harp and the wild animals is surrounding him. It is very interesting that this idea of these wild animals, especially of lions, appeared in Russia in the 12th century, because surely these sculptors who carved these lions at least knew and at least learned the detailed description of these animals, because really you can easily recognize lions here on this slide. This architecture of North Russia, both cities are North, Novgorod and Vladimir, can give you an idea of the sources of the development of architecture of Moscow. Moscow by itself is a typical medieval town. It is the most typical town of all the cities in medieval Europe and Russia. It has the very typical plan for the development of the city, the Kremlin in the center, and then together with the growing of the city itself, its fortifications were also enlarged. Then the second row of the walls, it is seen here, the third row of the walls, and the fourth row of the walls. And radiuses, they were the roads to different parts of the country. That's why it is some sort of radial and circular plan. And this plan of Moscow is still in existence. The only thing, it is highly developed, and it occupies now only the central part of contemporary Moscow. But the architecture of Moscow was developed beginning from the end of 15th century, when this Kremlin, which is in existence now, was built. You can see here the Kremlin, whose composition repeats a little bit the Novgorod Kremlin also, the belt of fortifications, the group of the cathedrals in the center, which were formerly surrounded with wooden buildings. This palace, this great Kremlin palace, belongs to the second half of 19th century. Formerly, the small palace stood here. And you see the central group of Moscow cathedrals is still in existence and still in the very good state of preservation. And this central group represents the sources from which it was taken. This cathedral was built, this so-called Blagoveshchensky cathedral, was built by the architects from Pskov, the area which was very close to Novgorod. This cathedral Uspensky, or Assumption Cathedral, was built also after the example of one of the Vladimir cathedrals. It was built by an Italian architect, Aristotele Fioravanti, but this architect was sent firstly to study this old Russian architecture. Oh yes, excuse me please. To study this old Russian architecture. Here you can see the architecture of the 16th century. The 16th century was the century during which all the Russian lands were united around Moscow, and that's why in this century this architecture represents some sort of it represents the unity of the country, the unity of Russian government, the Russian state, with the capital in Moscow. You can see here one of the best examples of the architecture of 16th century, also so-called the Saint Basil Cathedral in Moscow. This cathedral is practically the cathedral which was built in honor of the victory over the Tatars. That's why its structure is like this. Practically there are 9 separate churches united in a single building. This central church and 8 churches around this central pillar. Every church belongs to one of the saints, but you see the central church is built in honor of the Virgin, because it was the day in which one of the main victories over Tatars were held by Russian army in the 16th century. And one of the best buildings or so-called temple monuments which represents the unity of the Russian government in 16th century is represented here by the church in the village of Kolomenskoye near Moscow, and this single pillar with the very small internal space represents a very peculiar type of the churches, monuments which were built in Russia in this 16th century and even later. In Russia they did not know monument in our understanding as they were built later in the 18th and 19th century, but the builders wanted to express their feelings on the unity of the government with the help of such structures like this church in this Kolomenskoye village near Moscow, which also belongs to the beginning of the 16th century. After the liberation of Russia from the Tatar invasion, Russia started to develop rather quickly, and the 17th century was the century of rather peaceful existence of Russian state. And the architecture of that period is much more joyful than the architecture of the earliest periods. But here, before to go to the 17th century, I want to show you one of the earliest examples and one of the best examples of Russian wooden architecture, to give you at least the very brief impression on this architecture, to show you only one slide of this. There are...
I don't think they can hear you. Excuse me.
Like this?
Yes.
Yes, that's... Yes. You see, this architecture is one of the complexes of wooden buildings in the small village on the Great Lake in the north region of the country, the Onega Lake, so-called village of Kiji, and two churches which belong to the late 17th century and beginning of 18th century are still in existence there. But you see, you can easily see here the sources also of this wonderful architecture of Saint Basil with multi-cupola structure, and of this church in Kolomenskoye, the origin of which can be seen here in the belfry, in this Kiji compass. But as I told, this architecture of the 17th century was much more picturesque. The forms of this architecture became more complicated, and it is very interesting also that even such fortifications which look here as the mighty walls with towers and so on, they are only the false fortification. Practically it is also only the fencing around the residence of the metropolitan of the city of Rostov, also in the northern part of Russia. This residence of the Rostov metropolitan was built in the middle of the 17th century and represents one of the examples of the decorative architecture of 17th century. These mighty walls were not more than only the mean of communication between different buildings in this metropolitan residence. And even more buildings can give you an impression on the picturesque appearance of Russian churches and civil buildings of the 17th century. This church in the city of Nizhny Novgorod, now it is the city of Gorky at the Volga River in its middle stream, belongs to one of the masterpieces of so-called Russian Baroque of 17th century. You see very rich plastic of the walls, very rich plastic of decoration, and very rich colors of this church. It was very typical for the architecture of this 17th century. But on the other hand, here in this church, which belongs to the very end of the 17th century, you can already see some signs of the European architecture. You can see here this order structure, these two-storied, even three-storied orders with the columns, and even the framing of the windows can show you some elements of the Western architecture, of the classical Western architecture. The beginning of the 18th century was the time of the great changes in the life of Russian state and in the life of Russian society. During this century, Russia started to establish more close relation with the Western countries, such as with the Western Europe. And you see a lot of elements of West European culture were introduced into the Russian life by the prominent Russian king, Russian Tsar, Peter I, or Peter the Great, who introduced not only the elements of Western culture, but who founded the Russian industry, Russian fleet, and who improved highly Russian trade connections with the Western countries and with all the world. And even it was the beginning of 18th century when the great changes in Russian architecture happened. These changes were connected with the building of the city of St. Petersburg, now Leningrad. This city was built according to the regular plan. One of the first cities in Russia, and also one of the first cities in Europe, built completely after the regular plan. This three-ray plan of Petersburg is well known in the history of town planning because it represents this three-ray system in the way which is quite different from three-ray system of Rome and three-ray system of Versailles near Paris. These three streets are oriented to the building of Admiralty standing in the very center of Petersburg. This Admiralty building is one of the members of the great architectural ensemble of the center of the old St. Petersburg. But up to now, this ensemble, which was created mostly at the end of 18th and at the beginning of 19th century, during some 60 years, 50, 60 years of the 18th and 19th century, this ensemble is striking by its unity and by its beauty. But the planning was done in the first half of the 18th century, the planning of Petersburg, but the building of its ensembles was completed in the middle of 19th century, and practically it was started at the end of 18th century. Let us see some ensembles of Petersburg. We shall see now only some elements of this central part of Petersburg, this Palace Square, Stock Exchange building, and Admiralty building, probably the most beautiful structures of the old Petersburg. And also we shall see the prominent monument of the Peter I, the founder of Petersburg. And first slide will represent you the view onto Neva River with this fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul at the background, and of the buildings of Academy of Science at the foreground. Oh, something. It does not work. Something happened with this remote control. I do not know, no? Excuse me, some technical troubles.
Can we do it manually?
Probably it is disconnected there. No.
Let's try it. Switch.
And you can see the central part of St. Petersburg. Oh, not so quickly. I will tell you. The central part of St. Petersburg with the Neva and with the buildings of the Academy of Science, which can give you an idea of the beauty of this wonderful North Palmyra, as it was told by many, as it was called by some people and by many people in Soviet Union and in Leningrad especially. You see that the appearance of these buildings is completely different from anything which was shown to you before. Really, it was the period of the great changes, and all the architecture of Russia was beginning from the 18th century and during the 19th century was developed in the same way with the architecture of Western Europe. The only thing, as in every country, the next please, as in every country, its architecture had its own character, its own characteristic features, as it is seen, for instance, at the background and the Winter Palace, which represents this Baroque in Russian architecture of 18th century, which looks similar to the Western Baroque, but here it is quite different because it used to be constructed not of stone like in Western Europe, but of brick and plaster, and painted with bright colors, which never happened in the Western Europe. It is the central ensemble of St. Petersburg. It is the Palace Square with the Winter Palace, as I told, at the background, and with the building of the General Staff at the foreground, which was built by the very prominent Russian architect and town planner Carlo Rossi, who built a lot of ensembles of in the center of Petersburg, and to whom who was among the greatest builders of this capital of Russia. And in the center of this Palace Square, the Alexander column is standing. It is also the monument for the victory over Napoleon during the War of 1812. And this column is also rather interesting monument to the building technique of that period, because it is built from a single piece of granite which was brought from Finland in the middle of century, in the 1839, and which was put just on its place with the help of very complicated engineering structure which was built here especially to construct this column. So, oh, it works again. And another building, it is the building of Stock Exchange, which represents a peripteral type of the building in the very center of St. Petersburg, and which is a sort of a static center of all the city around which all the other ensembles are formed. And one of the best examples of the buildings of St. Petersburg of this time of the beginning of 19th century is Admiralty Building, which is also a classical building, but also it is quite original because practically nowhere else such type of the tower with a golden spire is in existence like here in Petersburg. That's why it became a sort of a symbol of Petersburg, this Admiralty Building, which originally was a shipyard and later became also the building, only the building of the Navy administration of the Russia, beginning from its building in the 19th century. And one of the best monuments in Russia is represented here by the monument to the Peter the Great, built, which was sculptured by a prominent French sculptor, Falconet, who created this excellent monument to the Peter the Great. And to show you one of the last examples of St. Petersburg architecture of the classical period, it is necessary to show you so-called the Theater Street with the Alexander Theater at the background, which was built also by Rossi, by this prominent town planner and architect of St. Petersburg. This classical Petersburg was probably the best creation of Russian architects of 19th century. Of course, a lot of buildings, a lot of cities were built in that period in Russia. At the end of 18th century, nearly 400 of Russian cities were replanned completely by the special commission made of architects and town planners. But the building of these cities was done in the 19th century mostly. That's why the appearance of many old Russian towns is an appearance of a classical cities, which have the regular planning and such classical buildings. It is possible to tell a lot about the architecture of Russia of different periods, but I showed you only probably the best pages of the history of Russian architecture, beginning from the 11th century, from the 10th century, from the 10th century and up to the 19th century. And you see, the new page in the development of the Russian architecture and all the architecture of new created country of the Soviet Union started practically in the 20th of this century. Probably it was one of the most interesting periods in the history of Soviet architecture. This creative ability of the young generation of architects of the 20th of our century was very great. Just during this period, a lot of new ideas were introduced into architecture. A lot of new names appeared in Soviet architecture at that period, such names as Leonidov, Ladovsky, Melnikov, and many other architects. They created practically the new type of architecture, and they started to work out some theoretical basis for the new architecture of the new century of industrial development. But unfortunately, the conditions in the country in that period, in the 20th, were very poor. All the country was destroyed by two wars. The First World War and the Civil War, which lasted up to the 1921 and up to the 1922. It was the period of the reconstruction and of building all the Russian economy of that period. Not only Russian, but all the economy of all the new created Soviet Union. That's why the conditions for the development of new architecture was very poor. This country was short of building materials, of steel, of glass, even of bricks. It was difficult to build even the simple dwelling buildings, and only a few buildings of that period were really built. One of the greatest constructivist structures which belonged to the end of 20th to the beginning of 30th is this building, this great complex of office buildings in the city of Kharkov in Ukraine, built by the architect Serafimov of that period. It represents the trends of new Russian architecture. But Serafimov was not the main creator of new ideas in architecture. As well as, for instance, this architect of this Moscow planetarium, Barsh. I just show this example of this Moscow planetarium because only yesterday I have seen the planetarium in Chicago, which was built in the same time with this planetarium, only also at the end of 20th. That's why that time even during the very heavy period for this building activity, these first Soviet architects, as an author of this planetarium, the very prominent Soviet architect Barsh, which is still living and working in our institute. He is one of the professors in our institute. You see, the architects were able to create some interesting pieces of new architecture. But the only thing, of course, is possible to mention here, that instead of concrete and steel, which was necessary to use for such new type of architecture, brick, plaster, and wood was used. That's why the architects of that period were not able to realize their ideas completely. And most of them were not realized and were only drawn in the drawings. And probably one of the most interesting architects of that period of 20s was Leonidov, who did not construct nearly nothing, but who made a lot of projects which practically belong to our time, not to that time. It is one of them. A residential, an apartment house, which really looks like apartment houses, which were started only somewhere in 50s. And really, in these works of Leonidov, which were done in the 20s, it is possible to see some features of the new architecture of 50s and 60s, and even of the architecture of today. But unfortunately, this architect was born earlier than it was necessary. He was very talented, and his last work were the sketches for the United Nations buildings, but only the sketches. Really, it was nearly impossible to realize his ideas, which required the building technique only of this period. Such works of Leonidov, like the Central Lenin Library in Moscow, was represented as a gigantic sphere made of steel and glass, which could not be realized in that period nowhere. But really, his ideas influenced greatly all the development of Russian and Soviet architecture of the latest periods. You see, his ideas are well known all over the world now, and many of his ideas were realized later in 30s and 40s in the works of the modern, of the contemporary Western architects. But I say it was not the time to realize such buildings. The architecture in Soviet Union in that period, in 20s and 30s, was oriented mostly to the building of the dwellings for the people. And these dwellings were built in a very large scale. Only in the middle of 30s, the country was reconstructed enough to be able to start the reconstruction of the cities. The plans for the reconstructions of many cities were done in that period. The greatest plan of the reconstruction was the plan of the reconstruction of Moscow, which was done in 1935. Moscow at that period was still a typical medieval town with very narrow streets, with the old plan, and it was a necessity to clean Moscow from the slum areas, to organize the new residential areas in Moscow, and to reconstruct the central part of the city. And this work started to be done beginning from the 1935. A lot of parts of the city were reconstructed at that period. I will give you only one of the examples of the reconstruction of Moscow at that time. It is the center of Moscow before revolution, and such was the very center of Moscow up to the middle of 30s. The old city covered with the small buildings, practically slum buildings, very poor, and you see the density of building was also very high in the central areas of Moscow. And this central area had to be reconstructed in the first row. It is so-called Okhotny Ryad. Now one of the central streets in Moscow, it is with the great buildings built in the late 30s. And just near this Okhotny Ryad, which means the hunting row, the Gorky Street is in existence. Here you have seen here at the last slide this street in its original appearance. And here is this Gorky Street, which was very narrow, only some 16 meter wide, 16 meters, how many feet? 20, 40, about 50 feet wide only. And of course, it did not work very well. And it was one of the first streets which was reconstructed in Moscow. You can see here that this brown color, there are the buildings built before the Second World War in this street. These buildings, these pink buildings, this one more, are the buildings which were moved from their original place backward. Monuments of architecture, these two. And this third monument of architecture here in the courtyard. Red buildings were completed after the Second World War, which we call the Great Patriotic War. And the width of this building appeared to be thrice more than before. And all the streets was completely reconstructed. Here is the appearance of this building as it looks, not now, but as it looked some 10 years ago, but nearly the same like this. In this part, nothing changed. Only at this side where we are standing, one more hotel was built. You see, this street started to be one of the first streets which represented the way of the reconstruction of Moscow, the reconstruction of the center of Moscow in the 30s. And it was not only the single street. A number of streets were reconstructed, cleaned from the slum areas, not only the front sides of the streets, but all the blocks inside, and Moscow started to appear a new city. The same thing happened in many other towns, in many other cities. Some areas in Leningrad and Sverdlovsk, in Minsk, Kiev, and other cities were reconstructed at that period after the special general plans created for these towns. One of the squares, the central square in Moscow, the Red Square, was also reconstructed. Its planning was done anew. At one of the sites, the Lenin Mausoleum was built by an architect of Shchusev, and the special stands at the sides of this mausoleum for the people to see the colorful celebrations of the big festivals. These stands were also built here. This Lenin Mausoleum belongs to one of the best pieces of architecture of the 20th and 30th. You see, it is built in such a way that it just forms the ensemble with the old Kremlin walls, because its color decision and its volumetric decision is not controversial to this existing ensemble of the Red Square, which was created, the beginning of which goes even to the end of the 15th century. Red Square, I want only to tell you that Red Square is not a new name. It is a very old, it is the ancient name of the central square of Moscow. Red in Russian means not only the color red, but red sometimes means beautiful. That's it. Is Red Square had its name from the very ancient time, but it is well known that in 15th century it was called already Red Square. Yes, but in 1941, thousands of Russian cities and villages were destroyed. It is the destruction of one of the cities only, Stalingrad. After Stalingrad battle, this city appeared only, you see, like this. No buildings were in existence in that period in this city. In the ancient city of Novgorod, which you have seen at the first slide, after the liberation of this city, only 4 houses were still standing. 4 houses in all the city, and wild cats were running about. Nothing more. And you see, the same thing happened with Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, and many other cities. It was enormous work to reconstruct them, to build them again. But it was done in a rather short period. This recovery of these Soviet cities destroyed during the Great Patriotic War was practically completed in some 10 years. At the middle of 50s, most of the cities appeared already in such view. It is the same area of Stalingrad 10 years later. Of course, we understand that probably the style of architecture, this highly decorative architecture which was used in that period, probably it's not up-to-date architecture. It was not the architecture of this period, not such as modern as architecture in many other countries. But you see, it is possible to explain the feelings of the people of that period. They wanted to celebrate this victory, in which the victory in this war, during which 20 million lives of Soviet citizens were lost. 20 millions. It means that no families in Soviet Union stood aside from this war. And you see, I remember already by myself well this period of this recovery of the cities, of the creation of this post-war architecture. We felt that we had the great victory. We wanted to impress it in some forms. And you see, the forms of modern architecture was absolutely not suitable to show the triumph, the victory, and so on. We looked backward sometimes. We created the architecture which looked like the architecture of the past. But it belongs to the very certain period, to the very heavy period in our history, to the period of the recovery of the destroyed cities. We recovered not only these new cities, we recovered also the historical monuments of our country, which was like this. It is one of the best creations of the architecture of 18th century. It is Petergov, near Leningrad, the former palace, which was destroyed by the German artillery completely. It was like this. And it looks now again like this. It is the same palace, the same fountains. You can imagine how difficult it was to do everything, including all the decoration inside this palace, all the wood carving, all the works, and even this sculpture in the foreground. It was stolen by Germans and brought to Germany. And it was reconstructed again after the photographs by the sculptors in Leningrad, the Samson and the Lion. And you see, we built again the masterpieces of Russian architects, of Novgorod, of Pskov, of Leningrad, and in the same time we built our new architecture nearly in the same way, like here. What to do? Forgive us, please. Yes, but you see one more thing. It was necessary to reconstruct the building industry in that period, because our cities were destroyed. We were very short of the dwellings in our country. It is well known that in this period, after the Great Patriotic War in 40s and 50s, very often the family occupied only one room. That's, for instance, 3 rooms apartment was occupied by 3 families. It was necessary to solve this problem. And you see, this existing building industry was not suitable to solve this problem. That we had to construct our building industry. And you see, the way to solve this dwelling problem was the creation of the factories for precast members and the building of the houses of precast members. But to create this industry, it was necessary to have time. And at the beginning, anyway, we started again to build our cities and to build Moscow again in the first row. One of the greatest areas which was built during the 50s, and even now it is under construction, but this part is all realized, was done in the southwest areas of Moscow. The area which is limited by the Moscow River and which goes the area which is limited by the Moscow River and which goes to the southwest direction, the best area in Moscow, rather high, and the best area to use it for the new blocks of apartment houses. Everything here was built during the first 10 years after the Great Patriotic War. In the center, Moscow University is standing, the new building of Moscow University, which is called often, I heard this name, this wedding cake. Really, these buildings, look, we come back to these buildings a little bit later. And here is one of the greatest residential areas of that period, is Lenin perspective with the new buildings. But these buildings were still built of brick because that time, at the beginning of the reconstruction of this area, of the building of this area, only such materials were mostly available in our country. In the center, Moscow University was stood. Of course, it was the architecture which now looks rather strange for the time in which already such buildings like Seagram in New York were started to be built, and many other buildings and pieces of contemporary architecture in other countries started to be built. But in Soviet Union, such strange architecture appeared. Really it was. Practically, it was the experience and it was the experiment which was done just after the war to introduce the new ways of building technique, because before we never built such high buildings. And all the development of Soviet architecture of that period, of 40s and beginning of 50s, was done in such way when the buildings were over-decorated. And the same thing was done here. But now, you see, we are thinking that probably it is not so bad to have some 6 or 7 buildings like this in Moscow, because now such buildings are in existence only in Moscow and nowhere in the world. And that's why you see the Moscow again was able to keep its own face, which is different from all the other cities, not only in Soviet Union, but from all the other cities in the world. Moscow University was built just in the middle of this new residential area. Here it is, which is represented here in this Lenin perspective. It is not the masterpiece of the architecture. Of course, the architecture of this Lenin perspective is not good enough, because the buildings are standing in a row without the great difference between them. But in planning, it was an interesting period. It was a period of the beginning of the buildings of new city, and also one of the experiments which showed that it is necessary to look for the other ways of the planning of the cities. Another great new great avenue was built in Moscow, so-called Kalinin Avenue, which was also planned by the plan of 1935, but was realized only recently. Again, one of the wedding cakes was standing here, this Hotel Ukraina, but the rest of this Kalinin perspective was built already in the new way and was built with the buildings of another appearance. It is the project of this Kalinin perspective which was done at the end of 50s, and at the beginning of 60s, in the middle of 60s, it was realized, and now it is one of the greatest new perspectives in Moscow. But again, we had here some experience in planning. It is a very interesting piece of architecture in Moscow. But when we realized that we just built it in the very center of historical Moscow, we realized that it is not the way of the reconstruction of historical part of Moscow, that it is necessary to look for the new ideas for the reconstruction of this historical part of the city, that it is impossible to cover it with such high new buildings. And you see, it was just the time when the competition was done for the ideas of the new planning of the center of Moscow, and it was the beginning to work out the new master plan for Moscow, because the plan of 1935 was practically realized during the 30 years. And it was also that time when this industry of this building industry was already created. A number of new factories which produced such elements for the new houses were erected, and you see the Moscow started to be covered with new 5-storied buildings from precast members like this. The appearance of this building was similar in all the residential areas, like this. And also it was one more experience in our town planning. We also realized that it is necessary to overcome this monotony in in our town planning. But on the other hand, our dwelling problem was nearly solved. Now it is very seldom to meet the family which does not have the separate apartment in Moscow. And not only in Moscow, but in all the other cities of Soviet Union. And in Moscow in the first row. But I say the new master plan was created. It is the plan of Moscow which was adopted in 1970. The territory of Moscow is a little bit larger than the territory of Moscow of 1935, but not very much. We are trying to keep Moscow in rather limited size, and that's why the new residential areas in this remote areas, rather far from the center, are built, are covered also with multi-storied buildings, and the average of this height of the buildings is lifted rather much in the recent years. And here to show you the approximate size of Moscow, it is possible to tell you that this ring highway around Moscow has the total length 101 kilometers. That is about 65 miles long. And the territory inside this ring is the territory of Moscow, the administrative territory of Moscow. Outside this ring, this so-called forest belt is made, in which only a limited number of residential areas has to be built. And this competition for the idea of the planning of the center of Moscow was realized in such projects. It is one of the projects for this competition in which I took part in 1966 for the idea of the reconstruction of the center, and this our idea was adopted, and we won the first prize for this idea. Moscow, in its historical limits, should be preserved in its historical appearance and only to be cleaned a little bit, and the new buildings has to be constructed not to destroy this planning and volumetric system of the old Moscow. And now this plan has to be realized, and the center of Moscow is under the special protection, and no buildings can be built here without the special, no new buildings can be built here without the special government decision in the center of Moscow. But at the in the new residential areas, at the sides of Moscow, we are building now the houses of different appearance. The houses, this apartment houses, very large apartment houses. It is one of the new residential areas, also in southwest direction. And you can see here the apartment house built recently, only some 2 years ago, also of precast members. Probably it is interesting to have an idea of planning of such houses. You can see here what types of the apartments are built in such houses. Mostly 2 and 3 rooms apartment. Here, this 2 rooms apartment, this bedroom, living room, and kitchen. 3 rooms apartment, it is here, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and living room. Oh, sorry, this bedroom belongs to this apartment. And here is 2 rooms apartment. It is one of the typical plans for the apartments which are built now in the new residential areas in Soviet Union. One more type of the buildings also of precast members, but with one single concrete skeleton in the center. You see these multi-storied apartment houses in the other residential areas which have another type of planning, but also the same type of apartments. You see in this section on every floor there are 3 apartments with 2 rooms, 3 apartments with 3 rooms, and 1 apartment with 4 rooms. It is only a very rough idea on these new buildings in Moscow. And one of the projects of the new residential areas in Moscow. Rather complicated planning already to create the new spaces to deal with the more artistic type of planning than was before, than we used to build in 50s and 60s, with the rows of with the buildings standing in rows along the streets. The new type of planning, the new types of apartments are built out. It is possible to tell a lot of this new experience in Soviet Union in this town planning and building of new residential buildings. But it is done not only in Moscow. It is Tashkent, one of the old streets in Tashkent. Tashkent had such appearance. And now the things are also changed. You see, it is the new residential area in the same city, which was heavily destroyed by an earthquake in 19 68. 68 years. And not only not only these new residential buildings, new university in Tashkent, also built recently, and new buildings of Moscow University also have already the different type of architecture. It is one of the new buildings of Moscow University, and the old, now it is already old building with the spire, is standing just in this direction to there. It is the building of humanitarian faculties, faculty of history, faculty of linguistics, faculty of philosophy. And Moscow University also completed recently, some 2 or 3 years ago. Not only in Moscow. It is one of the new buildings. It is the theater building in Alma-Ata, in the capital of the Kazakh Republic, one of the biggest also republics in Soviet Union. That's all over the country. We are starting now to build many new public buildings. We are able now to do it because this dwelling problem is nearly solved already, and we can spend to invest more means to build the new public buildings, to reconstruct and to restore the monuments of architecture. A lot of new towns, a lot of new cities were built during the last 30 years in Soviet Union. It is even looks a little bit wonderful, but during the last 30 years, about 1,000 new cities were built in Soviet Union. New cities with the population mostly about some 50 or 100,000 of inhabitants. And here is one of the most new cities in Soviet Union, in Volga region, this city of Tolyatti, near the gigantic automobile plant which is producing the Fiat type of cars, also about 1 million of cars every year. It is one of the new cities in the rather developed areas which are situated along the Volga River in the central region of Soviet Union. But we are building the new cities also in many remote areas and deserted areas, for instance, like this city at Caspian Sea, just in the very desert, the city of Shevchenko. You see, it is this Caspian Sea. It is probably the second salt reservoir of water in the world. The most salty is this Dead Sea in the Palestinian area. You see here, but here it is this Caspian Sea. It is also very salty. That it is no water in this town. It is all the water is brought here or made artificially from this salt water. There were no plants here. That's everything is to be planted artificially. But really, it was necessary to develop this city because a lot of natural resources are here in this area, which needs to be get out from the ground. And even why it is something is this last slide should be seen here. Oh no, that's probably something happened. Yes, and you see a lot of new cities in different areas of Soviet Union were built during the existence of our government. It is only a very short and brief ideas on the development of historical architecture and on the development of architecture, of the modern architecture in Soviet Union. I am limited by time. I have to finish already. Thank you for your attention.